The maintenance hangar at RAF Ridgewell, Essex, existed in a permanent state of controlled chaos. It was March 14, 1945, and the war that was supposed to be ending showed no signs of mercy. Inside the cavernous structure, beneath flickering work lights that cast long shadows across oil-stained concrete, Technical Sergeant Walter Kovac moved between the wounded aircraft like a priest among the dying. The smell was always the same: aviation fuel mixed with burnt metal, hydraulic fluid, and something else, something organic and terrible that the cleaning solutions could never quite erase: blood, vomit, fear. The B-17, flying fortresses of the 381st Bombardment Group, returned from their missions over Germany, carrying more than bombs and brave men. They carried stories written in shrapnel punctures, stories that Walter read every morning before the sun rose. At 42 years old, Walter Kovac was an anomaly in a war fought by boys barely old enough to shave. His hands were thick and calloused from years of manual labor, his back permanently curved from decades of bending over mop buckets and floor buffers. Before December 1941, he had been a custodian at Roosevelt High School in Akron, Ohio, the invisible man who arrived before the students and left after they'd gone home, the one who cleaned their messes and fixed what they broke without ever being noticed. The Army had initially rejected him. Too old, they said. Married with a dependent wife, they noted. No combat potential, they concluded. But Walter had insisted. Not out of patriotism or glory-seeking, but out of something quieter and more complicated. His younger brother Tommy had been at Pearl Harbor, serving on the USS Arizona when the Japanese bombs fell. Tommy never made it out of the ship. His body was still there, entombed in twisted steel beneath Hawaiian waters. So Walter kept returning to the recruitment office until they finally found a use for him. Technical Sergeant, Aircraft Maintenance Support, they called it. In reality, he was still a custodian, only now he cleaned war machines instead of hallways, scrubbed blood instead of chalk dust, and fixed things that most people had already given up on. The other maintenance crews tolerated him with a mixture of pity and mild contempt. He wasn't a trained aircraft mechanic. He didn't understand the complex systems of turbo superchargers or the intricacies of the Norden bomb site. What he understood was simple. Every surface could be cleaned, every broken thing had a purpose, and nothing was truly useless if you looked at it the right way. In his footlocker, Walter kept a collection of items that other men discarded: bent screws that could be straightened, fabric scraps from torn parachutes, pieces of perspex from shattered nose cones, sections of damaged aluminum skin that the sheet metal workers had replaced, and tubes of various adhesives, epoxy compounds, rubber cement, fabric glue, substances that the real mechanics dismissed as inadequate for serious aircraft repair. Kovac's junk drawer, the younger airmen called it. Sometimes they said it to his face. Walter never responded. He simply continued his work, arriving 2 hours before his shift started and leaving 2 hours after it ended, methodically cleaning and organizing and saving things that everyone else threw away. The morning of March 14th began like any other. Walter entered the hangar at 400 hours, while the base still slept, and the only sounds were the distant rumble of aircraft engines being tested and the occasional shout from the flight line. Today's mission would be Berlin, another maximum effort strike against the dying Nazi regime. The intelligence officers said the Germans were nearly finished, that their air defenses were weakened, that the Luftwaffe had fewer fighters to send up against the bomber streams. The crews knew better. Every mission to Berlin was a crucible. The flak batteries were still operational, still sending up walls of exploding steel that turned the sky into a killing field. The German fighters, though fewer in number, were now flown by desperate men who had nothing left to lose, men who would ram their aircraft into American bombers rather than let them reach their targets. Walter moved through the pre-dawn darkness toward the B-17, designated B-17G serial number 43-38274, nicknamed Mary's Prayer by its crew. The aircraft sat slightly apart from the others, and even in the dim light, Walter could see why. She had returned from yesterday's mission to Hanover badly damaged, with the number 3 engine feathered, multiple holes in her wings and fuselage, and hydraulic fluid leaking from somewhere in her belly. The crew chief, a sharp-faced 24-year-old named Lieutenant Morrison, had already condemned the aircraft for today's mission. Too much damage, he'd written in his report. Requires extensive repair. Not mission capable for at least 72 hours. But Walter had seen the faces of Mary's Prayer's crew when they'd climbed out of her yesterday. relief, gratitude, love. The pilot, a baby-faced captain named Eddie Garrison from Tennessee, had patted the bomber's side like she was a faithful dog who'd carried him home. The navigator, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, had kissed the fuselage before walking away. These men trusted this aircraft. They believed she would bring them home. Walter knew something the mechanics didn't. Sometimes belief was its own form of structural integrity. He began his inspection methodically, starting at the tail and moving forward, his flashlight beam revealing the extent of yesterday's violence. Flak damage to the vertical stabilizer, repairable. Holes in the waist section where German 80E Meteor shells had passed completely through, concerning but not fatal. Damage to the number 3 engine cowling, already being addressed by the engine crew. But when he reached the area just behind the cockpit, where the fuselage curved toward the wings, Walter's flashlight found something that made him stop breathing. A crack. Not a clean break or a simple hole, but a stress fracture in the aluminum skin, running diagonally for nearly 18 inches along a seam where 2 panels joined. It was the kind of damage that would be invisible to a casual inspection, hidden in shadow and grime, but potentially catastrophic under the stress of combat flight. At high altitude, pressurized and depressurized repeatedly, subjected to extreme cold, turbulence, and the concussive force of exploding flak, this crack could propagate. It could tear open. In the worst case, it could cause structural failure of the entire fuselage section. The proper repair would require removing the damaged section, fabricating a new panel, riveting it in place, work that would take trained sheet metal workers at least a full day, maybe 2. Mary's prayer would definitely miss today's mission, possibly several more. Walter stood in the darkness, his breath forming clouds in the cold March air, and made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone had known about it. From his footlocker, he retrieved several items. First, a roll of aircraft fabric, the cotton material used to cover control surfaces on older aircraft, now considered obsolete for modern metal planes. Second, a tube of industrial-grade fabric cement, the kind used for emergency field repairs on damaged flight suits and equipment covers. Third, a tin of rubberized coating compound that he'd salvaged from a damaged life raft. What Walter did next violated every regulation in the Army Air Force's technical manual. He cleaned the cracked area meticulously, removing every trace of oil, dirt, and corrosion. He cut strips of the fabric into precise shapes, each one slightly larger than the last. He applied the adhesive carefully, methodically, building up layers, fabric, cement, creating a laminated patch that bridged the crack like a bandage over wounded skin. The final layer received a coating of the rubberized compound, creating a flexible, airtight seal. When he finished, 2 hours later, the repair was nearly invisible, hidden beneath a careful application of olive drab paint that matched the surrounding fuselage. It was, by any professional standard, completely inadequate. The adhesive wasn't rated for the temperatures and stresses of high-altitude flight. The fabric had no structural strength compared to aluminum. The entire repair was essentially decorative, the kind of temporary fix that might hold together a child's toy but had no business on a combat aircraft. Walter knew this. He also knew that sometimes the universe needed you to believe in impossible things. At 06:30 hours, Lieutenant Morrison arrived for his pre-flight inspection. He walked around Mary's prayer with his clipboard, noting the repairs that had been completed overnight by the engine crew and the hydraulics specialists. He paused briefly at the section Walter had worked on, his flashlight beam passing over the freshly painted area. "Kovac, you cleaned this section?" "Yes, sir. Scrubbed and repainted. Some surface corrosion from yesterday's hydraulic leak." Morrison nodded absently and moved on. The crack was invisible now, hidden beneath Walter's careful work. The lieutenant completed his inspection and changed his report. "Mission capable," he wrote. "Cleared for today's operation." At 0800 hours, Captain Garrison and his crew arrived for the pre-mission briefing. They learned their target, the Daimler-Benz tank factory in Berlin's Marienfelde district. It would be their 23rd mission. 7 more, and they could go home. The crews walked out to their aircraft at 0930 hours, weighted down with flight suits, heated gloves, oxygen masks, and flak vests that offered the illusion of protection. Captain Garrison stopped when he saw that Mary's prayer was on the line, her engines already being run up by the ground crew. "She's flying?" he asked Lieutenant Morrison. "Patched her up overnight. She's good to go." Garrison's face showed relief mixed with apprehension. This bomber had brought them back 22 times, but every mission was a roll of dice, and yesterday's damage had been severe. Still, she was their ship, their home, their luck. The crew climbed aboard. 10 men, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners, each one believing that today they would survive, because the alternative was unthinkable. Walter watched from the hard stand as Mary's Prayer taxied out, taking her place in the long line of bombers preparing for takeoff. 36 aircraft from the 381st Bombardment Group would fly today, joining hundreds more from other groups scattered across East Anglia. Together they would form a metal river in the sky, flowing east toward Germany, toward Berlin, toward violence and death and the small hope of hastening the war's end. The takeoffs began at 10:15 hours. One by one, the massive 4-engine bombers thundered down the runway, clawing their way into the gray English sky with bellies full of bombs and fuel. Mary's Prayer lifted off at 10:32 hours, her landing gear folding up, her olive-drab form shrinking into the distance until she disappeared into the clouds. Walter returned to the hangar. He had other aircraft to service, other messes to clean. But throughout the morning, as he worked, he found himself calculating. 30 minutes to form up, 2 hours to cross the North Sea and occupied Holland, another hour to reach Berlin, the bombing run, the return journey. They wouldn't be back until mid-afternoon at the earliest, if they came back at all. The mission to Berlin unfolded according to the terrible logic of strategic bombing. The bomber stream crossed into German airspace at 1200 hours, flying at 25,000 feet, where the temperature was 40 degrees below zero, and the air was so thin that without oxygen masks, the crews would lose consciousness in minutes. The Luftwaffe fighters came up over Hanover, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, diving through the bomber formations with cannons firing, then rolling away before the American gunners could track them. Mary's Prayer felt the concussion of nearby explosions, saw bombers around them take hits, watched as one B-17 from their squadron went down with 2 engines on fire, parachutes blossoming in its wake like white flowers marking a grave. But the real horror began over Berlin itself. The flak was waiting. 88mm anti-aircraft guns, positioned in batteries throughout the city, firing shells that exploded at precise altitudes, creating a killing field of steel fragments and concussive force. The sky turned black with bursts, each one a flowering explosion of shrapnel. The sound inside Mary's Prayer was apocalyptic, metal screaming against metal, the airframe shuddering with each near miss, the acrid smell of explosive powder seeping through every seam and crack. A shell burst directly beneath them, lifting the bomber 10 feet straight up, rattling every rivet, every bolt, every tooth in every crew member's head. In the waist section, Staff Sergeant Johnny Martinez felt something warm running down his leg and realized with shame and terror that he'd wet himself. In the nose, Lieutenant Webb was screaming into his oxygen mask, not words, but just sound, pure primal fear given voice. And in that moment, at 25,000 feet above a dying city, subjected to forces that would tear lesser aircraft apart, the crack in Mary's Prayer's fuselage tried to open. The physics were inexorable. The aluminum wanted to fail. The stress fracture wanted to propagate, to tear, to rip the bomber's skin open like tissue paper. The metal groaned, the structure flexed, and for one terrible instant the aircraft hung on the edge of catastrophic failure. But Walter's patch held. The layers of fabric, bonded with adhesive that wasn't rated for this kind of stress, subjected to cold and pressure and violence that no engineer had ever intended them to withstand, somehow held. The flexible rubber coating stretched but didn't tear. The cotton fibers, woven together and laminated with cement, distributed the load across the crack, preventing it from opening. It shouldn't have worked. By every principle of aeronautical engineering, it was impossible. But sometimes, in the chaos of war, the impossible simply happens because it must. Captain Garrison felt his aircraft shudder, heard a sound like a groan from somewhere in the fuselage, but Mary's Prayer stayed together. They released their bombs over the target, watched them fall away toward the factory complex below, then banked hard to begin the journey home. The return flight was its own kind of hell. 2 more fighter attacks, more flak over the Dutch coast. The No. 2 engine began running rough, forcing the flight engineer to adjust fuel mixture constantly. The hydraulic system, damaged yesterday and barely patched, started leaking again, making the controls heavy and unresponsive. But the bomber flew. Mile after mile, minute after minute, she carried her crew westward. Over the North Sea, Captain Garrison descended to 10,000 feet, where the air was warmer and thicker, and the crew could breathe without oxygen. They removed their masks and looked at each other, faces pale, eyes hollow, hands shaking with adrenaline and cold, and the simple miraculous fact of being alive. Mary's Prayer touched down at RAF Ridgewell at 15:47 hours, her tires barking against the runway, her airframe groaning with exhaustion. Captain Garrison taxied to their hardstand and shut down the engines. In the sudden silence, the crew sat motionless for a long moment, unable to quite believe they'd made it back. 23 missions completed, 7 to go. They climbed out slowly, legs stiff, bodies aching. Garrison walked around his aircraft, counting the new holes. 47. 47 places where German steel had tried to kill them and failed. He reached the section behind the cockpit, where yesterday there had been damage that should have grounded the bomber for days. His fingers found Walter's patch, hidden beneath paint, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It was warm to the touch, heated by friction and stress, but intact, unbroken. Walter was waiting by the maintenance stand, clipboard in hand, ready to document the new damage and begin the repairs that would allow Mary's Prayer to fly again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until either the war ended or the aircraft's luck finally ran out. "She held together, Kovac," Garrison said quietly. "Don't know how, but she held together." Walter nodded, saying nothing. What could he say? That he'd violated regulations? That he'd used materials and methods that weren't approved? That he'd believed in something impossible and somehow made it real? Instead, he simply replied, "She's a good ship, sir. She wants to bring you home." Garrison looked at the older man for a long moment, seeing something in his face that most people overlooked. The quiet competence, the stubborn faith, the understanding that sometimes the most important repairs aren't the ones that show up in technical manuals. "Thank you, Sergeant." "Just doing my job, sir." But it wasn't just a job, and both men knew it. It was something older and simpler and more profound. It was the bargain that humans have always made with their machines, the unspoken agreement that if we care for them, they'll care for us. It was the understanding that sometimes survival depends not on strength or sophistication, but on the stubborn refusal to accept that something is beyond repair. That night, after the crew had been debriefed and fed and sedated with medicinal whiskey, after the maintenance reports had been filed and the damage documented and the repair schedules updated, Walter returned to the hangar alone. He stood beside Mary's Prayer in the darkness, his hand resting against her cold aluminum skin, feeling the rivets and seams and patches that held her together. 23 missions she'd flown. 23 times she'd faced the fire and come home. The engineers could explain it with stress calculations and structural margins and fatigue analysis. But Walter knew the truth was simpler and stranger. She flew because her crew believed she would, and she held together because someone had refused to believe she couldn't. In his pocket, Walter carried the latest letter from his wife Mary, the one he still hadn't answered. She wrote about ordinary things: the victory garden, the rationing, the neighbor's son who'd come home from the Pacific missing an arm. She wrote about waiting, about hoping, about the small daily acts of faith that kept people going when the world was on fire. Walter understood now why he couldn't write back. What could he tell her? That he cleaned bombers and saved scraps and made repairs that shouldn't work but somehow did. That in a war of grand strategies and massive forces, he'd found meaning in the smallest things. A tube of glue, a scrap of fabric, the belief that nothing was truly useless if you looked at it the right way? Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Above the English countryside, stars began to appear through breaks in the clouds, the same stars that shone over Berlin and Akron and the waters off Hawaii, where his brother Tommy still rested. The war would end eventually. Some planes would fly home, some crews would survive. And in the accounting of who lived and who died, no one would ever know about a Custodian's impossible patch, or how it held a bomber together over Berlin when by all rights it should have failed. But Walter would know. And Mary's Prayer's crew would know. And sometimes, in a world of industrial violence and mechanical death, that small knowledge was enough. The war ended 64 days later. Captain Garrison and his crew completed their 30 missions and went home. Mary's prayer flew 5 more times before Germany surrendered, each time returning with new scars, new patches, new impossible reasons for still being intact. She was eventually scrapped in 1946, cut up for aluminum in a Texas salvage yard, her individual pieces dispersed and melted down and reformed into mundane objects, screen doors, cooking pots, automobile panels. Walter Kovac returned to Akron and resumed his job at Roosevelt High School, cleaning hallways and fixing broken things and being invisible again. He never spoke about the war, never joined veterans' organizations, never attended reunions. The tube of fabric cement that had held a bomber together over Berlin sat in his garage for 40 years before his daughter threw it away while cleaning out his house after he died. There was no medal, no recognition, no place in the history books for a custodian who saved 10 men with materials that weren't supposed to work and faith that couldn't be calculated. But every April until he died in 1987, Walter received a card from Eddie Garrison, just a simple note, a few words. Still flying. Still remembering. Thank you. Because some repairs can't be seen on maintenance reports or measured in structural specifications. Some holding together happens in the space between what's possible and what's necessary, in that strange territory where human belief becomes its own form of physics, where a custodian's useless glue patch does the impossible simply because someone refused to accept that it couldn't. And sometimes, in the cold mathematics of war and survival, that stubborn refusal to accept the impossible is the only thing that saves us. And I,